All right, we're going to jump in here to chapters 10 and 11. We're still under the process of focusing. The next process is going to be evoking, so we're finishing up focusing on this learning plan. And so what we're going to be doing in the focusing phase of the four processes is determining values and determining goals. We're going to use ORs to help us narrow down, and along with agenda mapping as necessary to help narrow down and prioritize a client's list of issues that they want to work on. And we do that by also understanding their values and what they want to accomplish. So let's discuss goals and when goals differ. All right, and there's no clear-cut answer as to when it's appropriate to start working on goals. But the helper should have a clear indication that the client has been able to narrow down the focus of issues down to one or two areas, and the client has expressed a motivation to work on those areas. And so once we have that established, then we can move into trying to look at goals. Now, if you look at box 10.1 on page 121, this is a great simple tool that you can use to determine whether or not your client is ready to move into the goal setting phase. And so you want to make sure you're in box A, because both answers to those questions are yes. And if it's anything other than yes for both questions, then it's time to go back to the drawing board and discuss with the client. All right. One of the things that we need to take a few minutes to discuss when we're discussing values and goals are ethical values. Ultimately, the client is going to decide what he or she is most motivated to work on and what goals he or she is wanting to accomplish or are wanting to accomplish. So our values as a helper kind of go by the wayside. We need to put their values first. And in order to do that, there are a couple of broad ethical values that helpers need to understand and follow. And I'm not very good at pronouncing these first two, non-maleficence and beneficence. The first one means first do no harm. All right, and so we have to take that into consideration when we are working with a client, that our own ethical values, our own beliefs do not get in the way. And we're all human, so we all have our biases, and we all have our own values and belief systems. And it's important that we keep those suppressed for the sessions working with clients, because ultimately they really have no bearing on the client. And even though the client may express they may express some type of link to your value system, you can't always assume that that's what their intention truly is. All right, the second one, beyond the absence of harm, the interventions are meant to provide benefit. So we want to make sure we're providing a benefit to the client. And that again means getting out of the way of our own beliefs and values and attitudes, leaving those at the door, and working with the client. All right, and then the third value is of course autonomy, which also ties in with in my spirit. We want to make sure we give the client room and freedom and security, safety to explore this possible change changes that they're looking to make in their lives. All right, and then the final ethical value that we want to take into consideration is the principle of justice. And this has to do with fairness, equitable access to the benefits of treatment, and protections against risks. So again, this kind of falls under autonomy. We want to make sure that we're treating everyone equally, and we're fair with everyone that we work with, and give everyone a chance to decide where they want to go and what they want to do. All right. And so we've discussed in the previous learning plan that values correlate with setting goals with a client. Okay. And what I mean by that is if you have a client that, let's say, wants to quit smoking, and his value, one of his values that he identifies with is he values a healthy lifestyle. He tries to eat right. He does try and actually exercise once in a while. However, it's not matching up with the smoking aspect because, of course, smoking does affect your health. And so, one of the things we have to take a look at when, let's call him Joe, for instance, identifies that as a value for him, we have to come alongside and say, okay, so you value a healthy lifestyle, and you've identified that you know smoking is causing issues with your health. So what do you think has changed with your values, or what, tell me more about that correlation. We want to get the client's perspective on it because there is a variance between the two to some degree. And so it's good to get the client's perspective before you start working on goals, because if you start working on goals and one of the goals is to start exercising regularly because he values a healthy lifestyle and values eating right and, exercising, how does that correspond with the smoking? Because ultimately smoking is going to affect how he exercises and how he possibly eats as well. And so when you start working on the goals, before you work on the goals, you should already have those issues kind of worked out, and you should have a good understanding of that client's values. Now, the ethical values that we've discussed do play a role in the process, like I mentioned, and so we want to keep all four of those in our minds as we're working on setting goals and identifying values. Okay. Now, when should you use motivational interviewing and why? Well, motivational interviewing is not the end all be all. This is simply another tool in your toolbox, so to speak, to help you with struggling clients. And MI should only be used for clients that are experiencing ambivalence towards some type of change. So if you've got someone who really isn't concerned with a behavior that maybe they've been referred to you for, let's say a negative behavior, um, and they're not looking to change, then you may get some information and just kind of see where the client's at, but ultimately you're not going to use motivational interviewing because that person isn't ready to change. Also, if a client is processing, let's say, grief, let's say a family member has just suddenly passed away, um, that's not the time for motivational interviewing. It's the time to listen and to be the sounding board for that person and use other possible techniques as well, work through the grief process, etc. All right, and when a client is experiencing some type of life stressor, let's say a financial stress in their life, let's say they just lost their job, and that's created a huge stressor in their lives and their families. So that's not really the time to use motivational interviewing either. So only use it when a client is coming to you and they're experiencing ambivalence about making some type of change. All right. We talked about remaining neutral. Coercive power, as helpers, we do have coercive power, and that's why it's crucial that you remain neutral and non-judgmental, because by agreeing with clients, by voicing your own opinions, that can have an effect on what direction the client goes, whether you know it or not. The client's not going to come out and say, I completely disagree with you, and I'm not going to come see you anymore. What they're probably going to do more than likely is agree with your opinion or at least listen to it and then move on. And if it's highly offensive, they may just not come back. But we certainly don't want to push any of our opinions, our attitudes, our beliefs, our values onto the client. We do have a coercive type of power situation between a client and a helper. And the helper is in a very powerful position to have influence over a person's life. Okay, exchanging information. I want to spend some time on this because it's important. I don't know how many people I've had come through various classes that I've taught that have the understanding where counseling is where you go and sit with a counselor or therapist, you divulge your problems to him or her, and they give you advice on how to fix it. That's not real life counseling. That's not real life therapy. There is a place and a time to give information about let's say, for instance, an addiction. There might be a heroin addiction, and a client may ask the therapist for some specific information or education information about heroin. And so then it would be appropriate for that therapist to share information. But by and large, it's not the helper's job to give direction to the client and tell him or her what to do. But there is a way to do that in motivational interviewing, and it is called elicit, provide, elicit. And so you can read about that in your text. I'm just going to briefly discuss it here. What you want to do is if a client is requesting information from you, all right, and it can be your professional opinion or your opinion about what others have done in a similar situation, you are then given permission by the client to elicit that information. And so you will give that information to the client, and then you will ask for feedback from the client about the information you just provided. And it's a way to gauge whether or not the information was useful and beneficial to the client. All right, so there's some examples in your text that you want to go over. And so that's one way that we can give advice or give information. The other way is if we really see a client struggling in a certain area and we think that we have some information that could benefit them, we can request permission. So we can say something along the lines of, "Hey Joe, it sounds like you're really struggling in this area. Would you be okay with me giving you some information? Or, I have some information about how others have handled similar situations. Would it be okay if I shared that with you?" So we're asking permission from the client. Joe is going to say yes or no. More than likely, he's going to say yes. We provide the information, and then at the end, we want to elicit more information from the client to make sure that what we provided was on task with what they were looking for. So at the end, I would say something like, "So Joe, after giving that information, what do you think about that?" Or did you find that beneficial or helpful? If so, tell me a little bit about how that helped you. We want to get some information on that. Okay, the other thing I want to discuss here is well, we talked about offering advice, but self-disclosure. And a lot of people struggle with self-disclosure as well, especially beginning helpers, especially working in the field of corrections or addiction counseling. We want to kind of form a relationship with our client, and one of the ways we do that is by finding some common ground through self-disclosure. I'm not against self-disclosure, but I do set very strict boundaries and parameters around it because it can very quickly turn into a counseling session about you, the helper, versus the client. And we want to avoid that. We don't want to get into that. So in the engaging process, it would be okay to give some self-disclosure. Maybe the client has some two kids at home, little ones, and he or she may ask you if you have kids, and you can, of course, if you feel comfortable divulging that information, you can say, "Yes, I do have two children." But it's really up to you, and you want to make sure that whatever you divulge is you're comfortable with doing. All right, I'm going to continue this on another section.